Well, things have been very interesting for Russia over the last year or so. You certainly saw in the summer of 2008 a country that was feeling extremely confident. Oil prices were at an all-time high. They were feeling as though they were back on the world stage, that they needed to be taken seriously, that major issues of world politics couldn't be resolved without Russia. Then you had the financial crisis, and you also had the drop in oil prices. And it's made for a situation in which Russia is much less confident than it was in the summer of 2008, and it has shown that it has more limitations than perhaps it felt previously, certainly as it went into its war with Georgia. In August of 2008, it was extremely confident. That war, although it ended with Russia being able to declare the independence of the two breakaway provinces in Georgia, it was a difficult war for Russia militarily. It didn't perform perhaps as well as it thought it might, and so there was a definite sense by the end of 2008 into the beginning of 2009 that Russia had more constraints and limitations than it perhaps felt in the spring and summer of 2008. Well, for Russia, certainly under President and then Prime Minister Putin, the major hallmark of Russian policy has been control. Control over Russia and ensuring that you wouldn't have breakaway regions, control over the states of the former Soviet Union. And the North Caucasus is just the most dangerous place for Russia. It's the place for the most potential for breakaway regions, secessionist movements, lots of violence, and so it's an area that's going to continue to give Russia trouble as it seeks to make sure that it controls not only its territory, but the regions surrounding its territory. And that's also true because of Russia's interest in oil and controlling oil, and so for a whole host of reasons, that region's important and extremely difficult for Russia to handle. Well, the problem is you have a lot of different ethnic groups, you have a lot of different historical rivalries, and we saw how important nationalism was back in the late 80s, early 90s as the Soviet Union itself was falling apart. And just a lot of those same forces are still present within Russia. That's why for Putin, when he came into the presidency in 2000, first he was acting president and then was elected president, his focus really was just to make sure that these forces inside of Russia that he could put an end to those forces, centrifugal forces, sort of fearing that what happened to the Soviet Union when it broke apart in 1991 could happen to Russia. And that's been one of the major emphases of first his presidency and now his prime ministership. Well, Russia doesn't really have a lot of allies. There are states that are more or less dependent on Russia. Certainly a country like Armenia has had a great deal of dependence on Russia because Armenia faces both its problems and its relations with Turkey, although there's been some thaw there, and its relations with Azerbaijan. So normally where Russia has an influence are in places that are dependent on it, where leaders feel like they need Russian support. But in terms of allies in the world, Russia has very few. And in fact, when Russia declared the independence in 2008 of the breakaway provinces in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the only country that supported it was Nicaragua. Yeah, so Russia's relations with Ukraine are very tense, and that's been true ever since 5 years ago the Orange Revolution swept into power a group that Russia had not supported. And there was fear from Russia that that Orange Revolution would signal a move by Ukraine to move closer to the West and away from Russia. And there are problems within Ukraine in terms of differences from east to west, Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers. Politically, Ukraine has had a very difficult time putting together a stable government. And Russia also maintains a naval base in Crimea. And that lease is up in 2017. And the Ukrainians are saying that they might not renew the lease, which would mean that Russia would no longer be able to base its fleet there. So there are a lot of very difficult issues. And of course, unresolved is Ukraine's attitudes toward NATO and the European Union. Does it want to be a member? It's unclear. Of course, Russia does not want it to move closer to the West. And so one of the tools at Russia's disposal for showing its displeasure with Ukraine is that it's able to cut off energy supplies to Ukraine, which then, because the pipelines then go to other parts of Europe, impacts other parts of Europe. And so that's been a tool that Russia has used and just highlights Ukraine's dependence on Russia. Well, I think President Obama coming in really wanted to renew the relationship with Russia. He knew that really the relations with Russia by the end of 2008 were as bad as they've been since the Cold War, since the Soviet Union existed. And President Obama coming in wanted a new start, a fresh start, and suggested that the United States and Russia could push the reset button. The problem is that what the United States is looking for is both sides trying to adjust their policies so that they can take greater account of the other, but that each side has to put something into this reset. And the problem is, from the Russian standpoint, the period since the end of the Cold War has been just one unending policy after another of the United States humiliating Russia. And to the Russians, reset means the U.S. will accept everything the Russians have said about U.S. policy over the last 15 plus years, and that the United States will change everything it's doing, and then U.S.-Russian relations can be better. And that's not exactly what the United States has in mind, so there's still quite a difference of view on how to move forward in the U.S.-Russian relationship. The two biggest issues that emerged in 2008 that negatively affected the U.S.-Russian relationship was first the question of NATO's enlargement further into Eastern Europe and whether or not NATO would move closer to Ukraine and Georgia. This was something that the Bush administration, at least rhetorically, was supporting. And this was causing tremendous amount of anxiety in Moscow. Now, even the Bush administration, by December of 2008, had put in place a process by which Ukraine and Georgia would be reviewed annually by NATO, and so really had taken off the table this so-called membership action plan, which had, just because of the name, membership action plan, had really upset the Russians. And the second issue was missile defense. The Bush administration had declared its intention to deploy 10 interceptors, missile interceptors in Poland and a radar in the Czech Republic to defend against the potential Iranian nuclear missile threat. And the Russians took this as a deployment that would negatively affect their own security and their own nuclear deterrent. And so they were tremendously anxious about that as well. So when President Obama came in, he faced having to deal with these two lingering issues, of one of which NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia has really been put aside for some time, and the other, the issue of how to figure out, if the United States thinks it needs to defend against an Iranian threat, what's the best way to go about doing it? Do deployments in Poland and the Czech Republic make sense? Well, arms control is probably the easiest thing for the US and Russians to agree on, because the numbers of nuclear weapons on both sides are still so high that there's no reason not to go lower. It's also helpful because the Russians, for financial reasons, will have to go lower, and so they want an agreement with the United States to force the United States to go lower. Also, the value for the Russians in arms control is that they're the other major nuclear power. So as opposed to most other issues in the world where Russia is sort of just one of many and doesn't particularly stand out, in the nuclear area, it's the US and Russia. And so an arms control agreement between the US and Russia makes Russia look like a major power. And I think really, when you think about sort of what Russia wants out of the reset, my own view is they like the idea of resetting to 1972 or 1973. That was a period when the United States was weakened by both war and recession. It was a period when the United States was willing to accept Russia as a great power, and arms control was the centerpiece. And it seems to me that that's really the sort of the atmosphere that Russia wants to recreate, that effort to recreate a period when Russia really was a great power to be taken seriously and arms control was the centerpiece. Well, with respect to NATO enlargement, NATO doesn't want to take in any countries that are going to decrease security in Europe. And the disputes Russia has with both Ukraine and with Georgia make it hard for NATO really to think about moving to include those two countries. On most other issues in the world, it's very hard for Russia to stop the United States from doing something it wants. It can play a role at the margins. For example, the United States would like Iran not to pursue a nuclear weapons program. Russia can play a role in helping to support stronger sanctions at the United Nations. It may, through its relationship with Iran, be able to do something at the margins. But on most issues, Russia just does not play the kind of central role that it played during the Cold War.